let's talk about why you should play indie games, or perhaps why you shouldn't. I've done a lot of reviews of indie games on this channel, and I truly think we're in a golden age of indie games. There are just so many great indie games out there right now. And so I've been thinking a lot about why I started to play indie games in the first place. And I thought that I would list out some of the biggest reasons why I personally play indie games so much compared to AAA games. As with all my longer videos, feel free to skip around the various sections that I'll have, and I'll put timestamps for all these sections in the description down below. Also, when I say indie games, I'm just referring to games by smaller publishers with smaller budgets, things you wouldn't immediately recognize as AAA or not indie, so no Call of Duty, no League, no those kind of things. So let's get into it. One of the biggest reasons that I was drawn into indie games, and it's still one of the biggest reasons that keeps me playing indie games, is that they often do something really well in a unique and innovative way. You can see indie developers that have a really great idea and they just run with it in a way that you don't see with larger devs. These games can have really unique stories or puzzle mechanics, and they can be much shorter as well, so they don't usually overstay their welcome. Which is to say, you can experience the novelty and creativity of these stories or game mechanics or concepts, and you won't get tired of them because the indie devs don't feel the pressure to have 60 hours of gameplay. Really quote-unquote gameplay. There's no real filler in a lot of indie games as well, which is a positive. One example would be a game like Grease, which I reviewed in this channel a couple weeks ago. Grease abstractly displays the story of the title character's recovery through grief in a beautiful and visually compelling way. You restore color to this world as the protagonist comes to term with their loss, and this watercolor art style is just beautiful. And you have games like Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, that tell stories through game mechanics in an innovative and compelling way. You would never see these kind of mechanics, this kind of storytelling in AAA games because those games tend to be more conservative and take fewer risks. Both of these games are great and work really well as short indie games because they don't require a lot of gameplay time in order to be a lot of fun. There are obviously plenty of longer indie games as well, but the ability of indie devs to create these nice, short and sweet games allows for more experimentation and more unique games or storytelling. Along those same lines, you have some indie games that have just simple or silly concepts that are surprisingly fun. So for example, you have Balls Royale, which is a Pong Battle Royale game, which just sounds ridiculous, and it is, but it's also like surprisingly fun. There'd be no benefit to having a AAA budget to a game like that. Like, what are you gonna do? Make the graphics of the Pong battle like look that much better? Like, it's just silly. But it works perfectly as an indie game. It's really an indie game's place to shine with silly games like that. You also often find a lot of AAA protagonists to be bland or lacking personality. This is because everybody has to like the protagonist, the player character, by nature of the AAA games appealing to such a large and broad and diverse audience. So large developers will often, though obviously not always, create blander protagonists in order to not alienate some part of the player base. But indie games don't have that problem because there are just fewer people playing indie games. Just like with unique game mechanics, indie devs can take greater risks and create more compelling stories because they don't have to sell the game, to hundreds of millions of people in order to be successful. Although, obviously they would love to sell 100 million copies, but they don't have to in order to become profitable. In addition to seeing more unique games and indie games, you also see more unique game genres. So for example, you have stuff like roguelites, which are probably my most played genre of the last year, and roguelites are exclusively indie games. You also have genres like Metroidvanias or tower defense games that are similar, that they are almost exclusively indie games. It's not that AAA developers couldn't in theory create games in these genres. The name Metroidvania comes from Metroid Prime and Castlevania, and Metroid Prime was certainly a AAA series. And even outside of that series, there are a lot of AAA games with Metroidvania elements. But for genres like roguelites or tower defense games, there are no AAA games there, and there quite possibly never will be because these games don't require that big budget. People aren't sold in these games because of better graphics, resource-intense cutscenes, etc. that raise the cost of AAA games usually, which is also why you find a lot of these types of games with unique art styles, whether it's sort of pixel style or some sort of stylization like you see in Hades, for example, that might look nice but doesn't require a huge budget to make. Plus, a lot of these smaller genres have, smaller player bases, so the AAA devs have no financial incentive to create games. And so if you want to play certain genres like roguelites, which can be a lot of fun and have a lot of great games in them, you just need to play indie games because they don't exist in the AAA form. Indie games are also just straight up cheaper and go on deeper sales more frequently. So even the most expensive indie games usually start at $20 to $30, but many are much cheaper and go on sale quite frequently. You can also pick up a lot of indie games for less than $1 if you get them in certain bundles. So for example, there's a lot of bundles on Humble Bundle that can let you get a lot of indie games really cheap, or sites like Fanatical. If you'd like to hear more of my tips for getting free and cheap games, I did a video on that a little while ago that I'll link here and in the description. Of course, some of the reason for this is that these indie games are just shorter, but that's not always the case. If you buy What Remains of Edith Finch and expect to get 60 hours out of it, you're gonna be disappointed. If you spend $20 and play for about 2 hours, you're spending about $10 per hour, which might be construed as expensive. But not only games are like that. But if you buy something like Slay the Spire or Dead Cells that just has, 100 hours potentially of entertainment, you can easily pay $10 to get 10 cents per hour of entertainment. And there are also, some really short AAA games such as The Base God of War, which is maybe like 10 hours long. But as a whole, indie games are generally really great value for what you're getting. They're generally just much cheaper. So if you're really strapped for cash and you want to play a couple different games, indie games are definitely something you should check out because you can get really great value there for what you're paying and just, pay less. Indie games are also usually very easy to run. You can run a lot of indie games on pretty cheap hardware, which is something that's not true for most AAA games unless they're pretty old. So if you have a low spec setup, you should definitely look at indie games. They can be a lot of fun, and they can also just be something you can actually run on your computer without any difficulty. A lot of this is because indie games tend to rely more on unique art styles, whether it's pixel art or some sort of other graphics, over the typical hyper-realistic graphics that you see in bigger budget AAA games. Looking at something like Grease or Indie Game by Supergiant Games, you'll immediately see what I mean by that. It's a really cool art style that looks nice, that can sell the game by itself, but it's also not graphically intense, so it's really easy for computers to run these games, as opposed to something like Crysis that's really draining, or whatever the current equivalent of Crysis is for a super hard game to run. The final positive that I want to touch on before I get to some drawbacks in indie games are that the indie devs can often care just a lot more about the games than about the players. Indie devs are more likely to be in it for passion over profit, or at a minimum, they don't have some company oversight that forces them to put profit over passion. This can lead to devs being more responsive to players. So for example, in Risk of Rain 2, which is currently in early access still, the devs allow the players to vote for which class they wanted to be added to the game next. You also see some devs just put out free DLC, such as the Giant DLC in Dead Cells that just came out, or the recent PvP update DLC in Darkest Dungeon. It's really refreshing to see some devs that actually genuinely care about their game and put the stuff into it that's just really first and foremost for the players themselves, as opposed to trying to just extract money from the players in the most efficient way possible. Of course, there are still plenty of reasons why you shouldn't play indie games, and there's a reason why indie games are not popular as AAA games. So the biggest drawback indie games is that, well, basically every pro that I listed of indie games doesn't apply to all indie games, it only applies to some of them. There are just a huge number of indie games out there, and many of them aren't created that well, or they just don't do anything special. If you get really into indie games and start playing a lot of them, you'll eventually find yourself playing some disappointments, or you'll just need to sift through a ton of games in order to find ones that you really want to play. I mean, this isn't actually a unique problem in indie games. You'll find this with AAA games a lot, because there's just so many games being published. But it's definitely a problem that's more common in indie games because there's just so many indie games out there. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of indie games will try to experiment and do creative things that can just turn out really, really well and create these great games. But you also have indie games just completely miss the mark, or games that are just so ambitious, way beyond their budget or their programming capacities. Just remembering the overpromised and underdelivered release of No Man's Sky is a great example of something like this, where the indie devs just could not do what they wanted to do, which is probably the best way of framing that, as opposed to some sort of outright deception. But as a charitable reading, some indie devs just overpromise and underdeliver, not necessarily due to any fault of their own, but just sort of their budget and programming capacities. Indie games also usually lack the polish of AAA games that comes from just this larger budget. And it's usually immediately noticeable for something like the graphics that just don't have that smooth gameplay feel in different ways. So something like hitbox being slightly off, or just clunky movement controls. And even really great indie games usually have some area that's sort of janky or clunky. So for example, in Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, it has some really awkward controls. They're set up that way for a really good reason, but they take a while to get used to, and they can break immersion a couple times because they're just a little clunky. And in terms of price, while indie games are usually cheaper, there are some that are full price, the same as AAA games, or that has some incredibly predatory monetization practices. And finally, you'll often find that indie games are shorter than AAA games, whether it's because they're telling a story or because they're just sort of focused on some mechanic that doesn't need 20 hours. They can frequently be just less gameplay. You know, if you bought Grease or What Remains of Edith Finch expecting to get 100 hours of gameplay, you'd be incredibly disappointed because they're, only a couple hours each. This isn't really a flaw in games per se, but if you're the kind of person that wants to buy, 2 games a year and play those for hundreds of hours, you might not have that with indie games, or you'll have to be a lot more selective with what kinds of indie games you play. So are indie games worth your time and money? I would say absolutely yes. Again, I think we're living in the golden age of indie games. There's just so many great indie games out there that do things really uniquely, do things really well, that are just different and fun and great. In terms of bang for your buck, it's really hard to beat indie games. There are certain gems such as Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons that can really only be done with indie games. And there's some incredibly fun genres like roguelites that I play so much that are exclusively full of indie games. But indie games do also lack the polish, the graphics, the smoothness of gameplay that you see in a lot of AAA games that comes from their larger budget and larger amount of resources that they have access to. But also certainly just a ton of indie games out there that aren't worth your time. So you just have more games to weed through to find ones that you actually want to play, just because there's so many of them. But if you've never played indie games, if you've never given them a chance, you should definitely check some out. I have a deep love for a lot of indie games, which, is why I've reviewed so many indie games on this channel, which is why I created this video in the first place. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think indie games are worth it? Do you think they're not worth it? Do you think AAA games are just better across the board? Let me know in the comments, because I'd love to hear other perspectives on things like this. And please like this video if you want to help me out. And I hope that you found this video enjoyable or informative in some way. And I'll link some playlists of my reviews in the description below. And feel free to subscribe if you want to see some more videos like this from me. So yeah, thanks for watching.